Given the state of Ubisoft today, it's pretty clear that they're not the same company that they were many years ago, and I think most of us can agree on that. One franchise I absolutely loved about a decade ago was the Far Cry series. It gave us some of the most iconic villains, unforgettable stories, engaging gameplay, and overall just a very fun experience. Unfortunately, Ubisoft's game quality has definitely declined over the years, but let's take a moment to look back. Today I want to rank every Far Cry game from worst to best, including both the mainline games and the spin-offs. There were Far Cry games like Evolution, Instinct, the Wii game, and a few others that are all kinds of variations of Far Cry 1 that I have not featured in this video, simply because I have not played them, nor do I have any intention to go back that long ago and play them. Do remember that this entire ranking is my own personal opinion, so if I place your favorite game quite low, please try not to get triggered. With that said, let's get into ranking every Far Cry game in the series. Okay, so let's start off the ranking of every Far Cry game with last place, and at 9th place, I've gone with the original Far Cry game, Far Cry 1. Released in 2004, this game helped pave the way for many modern first-person shooters, thanks to its groundbreaking CryEngine, its massive open environments, and surprisingly pretty good AI if I remember correctly. This game was a technical marvel for its time. However, despite its impressive legacy, the original Far Cry has not aged quite as gracefully, which is why it's last place in my list. Alongside games like Half-Life 2 and Doom 3, it helped redefine what you could expect from first-person shooter games in the early 2000s. Now, I did not play this game at launch, which is expected given I would have been 4 years old if I did. I played it around mid-2010s, and I have not replayed it since, so my memory is a bit hazy on this game. To give credit where it's due though, Far Cry 1 looked incredible back then, and even today, some environments still kind of hold up surprisingly well. The gameplay centers around Jack Carver, a man stranded on an island filled with mercenaries and mutants, led by the not so subtle villain Dr. Krieger. The island itself becomes both your battleground and playground, and it's got, plenty of vehicles, weapons and enemies. For shooter games of this era back then, this level of freedom Far Cry 1 had was pretty rare, but you see, here's the issue with the game for me. When I played the game, the concept of it was amazing as expected. Something about fighting hordes of enemies, whilst also unraveling the story about some mystery of some sort was pretty cool. The freedom to approach objectives in different ways was quite original, and the open environments made it feel like you had endless possibilities for exploration and combat. But things take a sharp turn for worse later in the game, once we are introduced to an enemy called Trigens. Now, Trigens are these genetically altered enemies, and they make the latter part of the game feel painfully obnoxious. I say this because not only are they tough to kill, but also feel so random in a game where at one point, it seemed grounded in reality. Also, when you fight these Trigens, it feels like that old school video game difficulty, where frustration often outweighs the satisfaction of overcoming a tough fight. So yeah, I guess it's because of the lack of modern game mechanics like smoother aiming and less clunky movement makes some of the combat sections feel more like a chore than an enjoyable challenge. Despite these flaws, I will say Far Cry 1 deserves some credit for laying the groundwork of both the Far Cry series and the Crysis series that we know today. Coming in at 8th place, we have Far Cry New Dawn, which while relatively fun, ultimately fell short of being a standout Far Cry game. It serves as a direct sequel to Far Cry 5, set in a post-apocalyptic Hope County, Montana after the events of a nuclear explosion. However, despite the shift in setting, Far Cry New Dawn feels more like a DLC of Far Cry 5 than a fully fledged new game. The recycled map, though altered by some vibrant pink overgrowth and some post-apocalyptic decay I guess, it doesn't offer the same uniqueness to make it stand out. The game also fails to fully embrace the possibilities of its setting. So what I mean by this is, in other post-apocalyptic games, you can tell if it's post-apocalyptic or not, but Far Cry New Dawn plays it safe by sticking closely to the established Far Cry formula. You still take outposts, hunt animals and take part in the usual gunfights, but the new RPG-like progression system feels superficial, adding some type of grind to what could have been a more fun experience. Speaking of progression, the introduction of tiered enemies and weapons, along with the need to gather resources like ethanol, adds an unnecessary grind to the game. The ability to quote-unquote replay outposts for increased rewards feels more like a way to artificially extend the game's length than a meaningful gameplay feature. If anything, to me it feels like this disrupts the flow of exploration and progression, often leading to moments where you feel overpowered or even underprepared, depending on your approach. It's a repetitive loop that can get quite boring eventually. The villains, Mickey and Lou, were quite forgettable. They were not necessarily terrible like most Assassin's Creed villains, but compared to the iconic villains such as Vaas, Pagan Min and Joseph Seed, they just don't have that same impact. Even the protagonist, who just like Far Cry 5, is a voiceless character, and the protagonist lacks any personality, which is expected considering he doesn't bloody talk. They also recycle some side characters from Far Cry 5, which you could say is a positive, but also a negative at the same time, as it's just, okay, here's the same people and they don't really elevate the story. And speaking of the story, it's very short. In fact, I don't really know why they call this game a standalone experience. It should have been a DLC that you can take part in after the base game of Far Cry 5 has ended. Despite these criticisms, I did have some fun moments with the game, particularly when it came to interacting with Joseph Seed. His character arc was expanded upon in New Dawn, and it kind of helped redeem the controversial ending of Far Cry 5 for me. But apart from the limited amount of positive moments I had in New Dawn, it still ultimately falls short to place it any higher over any other games in this video. Now next up we have Far Cry 6, which is the most recent game in the series as of me making this video. I say as of me making this video because, you know, there's a Far Cry 7 in the works. Anyway, despite Far Cry 6 having a very ambitious setting and powerful performances, particularly from Giancarlo Esposito, aka Anton Castillo, which first of all is pretty impressive to even have in a game, Far Cry 6 ultimately falls short in some areas that define the series' best games. The game does have its strengths though, with Yara being a vibrant, immersive open world, filled with nice looking scenery, gunfights, and that expected Far Cry gameplay loop. The use of quite a lot of different vehicles, weapon types, and even animal companions like Chorizo the dog and the crocodile, whose name I just forgot, provides a lot of variety and fun moments. However, where Far Cry 6 starts to fall behind is in how formulaic it feels compared to its predecessors. The same structure of liberating outposts, completing side missions, and slowly toppling the dictator's power feels recycled from the earlier games. Now don't get me wrong, Far Cry is known for this and I understand that, but the lack of innovation in these mechanics becomes hard to ignore as you progress. At times, the game feels like it's running on autopilot, with little in the way of surprises that could have set it apart. Another issue with Far Cry 6 is the uneven tone. The story attempts to balance serious themes, such as revolution, dictatorship, and freedom, with these pretty strange, absurd, over-the-top gameplay mechanics. One minute you're deeply invested in the tragic story of Yara's oppressed citizens, and the next you're blowing up literal enemies with a backpack rocket launcher while listening to dubstep music. Yes, Far Cry has always straddled the line between serious and ridiculous, but Far Cry 6 does it in a way that's more forced and inconsistent to the theme, making it hard to stay emotionally invested. That's why there was never a moment in the story where I was like, oh no, that's sad, I'll remember that in 5 years time. That's not the case here. Now one thing I will say is while the characters are memorable and the voice acting is top tier, like seriously it's top tier, the story itself doesn't reach the heights of earlier Far Cry games like Far Cry 3 or 4. Anton Castillo on paper sounds like a dream come true. It's quite literally Giancarlo Esposito. There's no way for Ubisoft to fuck it up. But that's not the case, because indeed it did get fucked up. Anton Castillo's arc never quite reaches the dramatic payoff that many of us had hoped for. This, combined with the underwhelming twists and turns, makes Far Cry 6 feel like it's playing it safe instead of pushing the boundaries of what the series can offer. And sadly, that's the problem with most Ubisoft games, playing it safe to the point where they lack any innovation. At 6th place in my ranking we have Far Cry 3 Blood Dragon, an unapologetically ridiculous neon-soaked homage to 1980s movies, or rather action movies. If you grew up watching movies like Terminator, RoboCop or Predator, this game is a love letter to that era, complete with macho one-liners, cheesy dialogue, and a synth-heavy soundtrack. Hot take, but if this game was released in today's day and age, it would get destroyed by the public. Anyway, while its over-the-top style is certainly entertaining, it falls short in a few areas compared to the other Far Cry games in the video. So, Blood Dragon is set in an alternate 2007, where you play as cyber soldier Rex Power Colt, voiced by the legendary Michael Biehn, who oozes action hero vibes in every scene. The game's plot is simple: stop Colonel Sloan, your former mentor turned villain, from using Blood Dragon DNA to create a prehistoric apocalypse. The game is intentionally absurd, but that's where the charm of the game lies. It knows exactly what it's doing, and leans into its campy sci-fi premise with full force. Visually, Blood Dragon sets itself apart from the mainline Far Cry games, with its bold neon aesthetic and VHS style presentation. The world is bathed in purples, blues and reds, creating a retro futuristic vibe that feels right at home with the game's theme. Even the loading screens give you that nostalgic VHS experience. It's a style that works, but it can feel quite gimmicky after a while, and the novelty of it wears off faster than I'd hoped. When it comes to the gameplay, Blood Dragon is essentially a stripped down version of Far Cry 3. You've got the same open world mechanics, outposts to liberate and side missions to complete, but everything feels a bit more simplified. The leveling system, for instance, does not offer much freedom. It's automated, meaning you do not get to choose upgrades that suit your playstyle. Instead, you're given preset abilities as you level up, which can feel a bit limiting compared to the more customizable systems in other Far Cry games. One of Blood Dragon's biggest highlights is the introduction of the Blood Dragons, giant glowing creatures that can roam the island and can either be your worst enemy or your greatest ally. You can use cyborg hearts to lure them into enemy camps, causing chaos as they destroy everything in their path. It's a pretty fun mechanic, but like many aspects of the game, it can feel repetitive after a while. So yeah, while Blood Dragon is undoubtedly fun, it does not have the same depth or longevity as the other entries in the series. The campaign is very short, clocking in at around 6 to 7 hours, and the simplified mechanics make it feel more like a side project than a full Far Cry game. Okay, now just a heads up from this point on, these next 5 games are Far Cry games that I would not consider bad or pretty meh by any means. Anyway, in 5th place I've gone with Far Cry Primal. This is one of those games that definitely stands out for its setting, but it's also got a mix of things that work well and others that might not hit as hard. When Far Cry Primal was announced, I was pretty confused because how on earth would a prehistoric Stone Age kind of setting make any sense, especially for a Far Cry game, and to be fair, it certainly worked quite well. Taking the series back to the Stone Age was a bold move by Ubisoft. Instead of the usual guns and explosions, you're now armed with spears, bows and clubs, which adds a whole new challenge. The visuals are pretty nice as well, whether you're moving around a dense jungle or exploring snow-covered mountains. Something that this game did very well in is the survival side of it. Instead of the, traditional Far Cry experience, no pun intended, where you would roam the world and destroy shit with guns and vehicles, Far Cry Primal quite literally takes that survival challenge, where you're constantly scavenging for resources, hunting for food, and avoiding predators, like saber-toothed tigers and woolly mammoths. Now, while the setting is brilliant, the gameplay itself is of course the same Far Cry formula. It doesn't stray too far from the blueprint of previous entries, so even though you're in a whole different era, you sometimes feel like you're playing a reskin Far Cry 4, but with fewer modern conveniences like guns and vehicles. Of course, this game is not perfect by any means. The story was not that memorable if I'm being honest, the side characters were not explored that much, and of course the villains, which we all know are a staple of Far Cry, did not have the same level of depth. But then again, this game is set in the Stone Age, so who would a proper villain even be? A caveman? Oh, and I do like the whole companion system, where you can tame wild animals to help you out. That was quite unique and fun. It's a mechanic that I'd love to see more of in future games. But yeah, I'd say the survival aspect and the unique setting definitely carried Far Cry Primal, and it is a pretty good Far Cry game overall. Middle of the video is perfect. Far Cry 2 surprised me, especially for how old this game is. Not many people talk about this game because, well, it was released in 2008, and I'm sure like a lot of you watching were probably born around then. But regardless, 4th place belongs to Far Cry 2. Now, this game holds a special place in my ranking because of how bold and gritty it was for its time. Unlike later games in the series, which leaned more into colourful characters and fast-paced action, Far Cry 2 delivered a raw, atmospheric experience that stood out from the typical open-world shooter. The game's realism, its brutal depiction of war, and the way it forced you to adapt to the harsh African wilderness made it quite unique. You step into the shoes of a mercenary in Africa, tasked with hunting down the Jackal, a notorious weapons dealer who's playing both sides of a violent conflict between two warring factions. The character you play as is not a hero by any means, but a killer for hire, and the Jackal, who's now confirmed to be Jack Carver from the original game, is completely there in mystery. He's trying to end the war in his own twisted way, making you constantly question the morality of your actions. One of the main reasons I like Far Cry 2 is because of how immersive it feels. The game's mechanics like weapon degradation and the constant battle with malaria might seem like a nuisance to some, but to me, I kind of liked it because it made every encounter feel meaningful. You know, you're not just another overpowered hero, you're a struggling mercenary, and the environment is much as an enemy as the soldiers that you face. The map system, where you pull out a physical map and GPS to navigate, is a great example of how the game commits to this immersive experience. The day-night cycle, the shifting weather, and the dynamic fire spread system all create a living, breathing environment. I still remember how impressive it was to use the flamethrower and watch the dry grass catch on fire, burning everything in its path. It was not just a gimmick. The environment could turn into a tool or an obstacle, depending on how you used it, of course. Now sure, the constant respawning of enemies at checkpoints could get frustrating, and the missions sometimes felt repetitive, but those issues did not overshadow the depth of the world, and the satisfaction of tackling each mission on your own terms. The buddy system, while it's not perfect, added some nice choices for the game, giving you different ways to approach missions, even if you did not always feel connected to your buddies. So yeah, despite its flaws, the developers clearly cared deeply about Far Cry 2, and that passion shines through in every part of the game. It was far from perfect, but its ambition and atmosphere is why it ranks so high for me. Now for the top 3, I've gone with Far Cry 5 at third, which is by no means bad at all. In fact, third place is very good. Now this game is far from perfect. In fact, every game in this franchise is far from perfect. That's pretty much the truth. But there is a lot to love about this game. The story, set in rural Montana, stands out due to its very comforting setting and compelling villains. And yes, I did say villains. The main villain, Joseph Seed, is not your typical megalomaniac. What makes him so interesting is how strange and eerie he is. Far Cry 5 plays heavily into the themes of faith, belief and the dangers of zealotry, and Joseph embodies this perfectly. He's not as outlandish as previous villains in the series like Vass or Pagan Min, but his calm and collected demeanor, paired with his conviction that he's saving humanity, is quite chilling. He's the kind of villain that makes you question whether he's a truly evil person or just a product of his environment. The Seed family as a whole adds an interesting selection of characters to the game. Each sibling has their own distinct personality and method of control, making for some engaging confrontations. John Seed's power of yes cult is rooted in self-actualization, but with twisted undertones. Jacob Seed is a militaristic leader, focusing on social Darwinism, while Faith Seed manipulates people through the drug bliss, creating trippy experiences for those under her sway. However, while the story is pretty interesting despite having a literal mute protagonist, Far Cry 5 suffers from some pretty questionable design choices. The forced kidnappings during the game can be frustrating and disrupt the pacing. Instead of allowing you to prevent these kidnappings, the game forces you into confrontations with the Seed family at certain points, which takes away from the feeling of control in an open world environment. Additionally, the resistance meter system, where you can fill up the confrontation bar simply by doing side activities instead of story missions, feel like it undermines the story progression. Gameplay wise, Far Cry 5 does not stray far from the formula set by its previous games, but in terms of innovation, it doesn't offer much beyond what Far Cry 3 and 4 established. Montana, while unique for being the first American setting in the series, lacks the exotic appeal of the previous games. The world can feel a bit empty at times, though it ties in well with the story's themes. The soundtrack, however, oh boy, Far Cry 5 has the best soundtrack in the series hands down. One feature that I think was underrated in this game was the arcade mode, which allowed for a lot of creativity and customization. It is a shame that Ubisoft did not carry this feature into Far Cry 6, as it was one of the best additions to the series in Far Cry 5. So yeah, while Far Cry 5 has its flaws, its strong story, fascinating villains, and gameplay make it worthy of being ranked here in the video. And now we have the top 2. These next 2 games are so hard to rank that I changed my mind a few times, but eventually I came to this conclusion. So before I talk about Far Cry 4, which is second in this video, just remember that this game could very easily be first. It's just very tricky to decide. Now, while Far Cry 4 may not top the story heights of Far Cry 3, it has its own merits that make it stand out as one of the best in the series. First of all, there's the villain, Pagan Min, who in my opinion is one of the most charismatic villains in video games, or even media hands down. Troy Baker's performance as Pagan Min is phenomenal, making him not just another villain but a complex character who you cannot help but be intrigued by. He steals every scene he's in, and I think the game would have benefited greatly from having more interactions between him and the protagonist RJ Gale. The story in Far Cry 4 revolves around tough moral choices between the 2 leaders of the Golden Path, Amita and Sabal. Neither character is particularly likable, if we're being brutally honest, but that's intentional. Both present different but equally flawed visions of Kirat's future, and RJ Gale is caught between choosing the lesser of 2 evils. I love how the game slowly reveals the shortcomings of the so-called good guys, making you question who you should be supporting. If there was one flaw in this game, I'd say it's the protagonist. Despite RJ Gale being fully voiced, his character does somewhat feel distant in his own story. There's an intentional blank slate approach to his character, perhaps to allow us to project ourselves onto him, but I wish he had more personality and interaction, particularly with Pagan Min. This could have really boosted the story's emotional stakes, something that Far Cry 3 did very well in. Gameplay, however, is where Far Cry 4 shines the brightest for me. The mechanics feel smoother than the game before, with a greater variety of weapons and the introduction of gun customization. This improvement in the gameplay loop makes the combat more engaging. Liberating outposts, hunting wildlife, and completing missions all feel more satisfying thanks to these refinements. And then there's also the world of Kirat, set in the Himalayas. The stunning vistas, the forest, the detailed environments, this all makes Kirat one of the most immersive open world settings in the series. So yeah, in the end, Far Cry 4 has a unique kind of charm that I feel deserves its spot near the top. The moral side of the story, combined with a more polished gameplay and a stunning world, is what makes it second place, and perhaps even first place if I really wanted to. And last but not least, the best Far Cry game in the franchise in my opinion is Far Cry 3, a game that a lot of gamers in general would know about, simply because it came at a time when Ubisoft were passionate and talented. There's many reasons why this game is my favorite Far Cry game, and it starts with the story and the way characters are written. Jason Brody's transformation is unlike anything we've seen before in the franchise, and it's what really hooked me. At first, he's just a regular guy, a typical rich kid who finds himself in a terrible situation. But the more you play, the more you see his descent into madness, his internal struggle, and ultimately his acceptance of the darkness. The way Jason and Vaas mirror each other is brilliantly done. They're both victims of the island, but they go down very different paths. Vaas, of course, is unforgettable. He's quite literally one of the best villains, not just in Far Cry, but in gaming as a whole. The insanity he brings to every scene keeps you on edge, and his unpredictable nature makes him truly terrifying. But what I find really interesting is how Hoyt, the other antagonist, often gets overlooked. While Vaas may be the face of the chaos, Hoyt is the mastermind behind it all, and he's just as essential to the story. His cold and ruthless demeanor is a perfect contrast to Vaas's unhinged personality, and I think that makes him an underrated villain in the series. Citra's role in seducing Jason to embrace his darker side, along with the presence of Jason's friends as the last remaining link to his former self, sets up an internal battle that really defines the game. Jason's fall into violence and insanity feels organic and inevitable, and it's a story arc that adds a lot to the game that most other Far Cry games just don't have. That for me is what elevates Far Cry 3 above every other game, the character development and the psychological story that drives the plot. Beyond the story though, the gameplay and setting are equally impressive. Rook Island is beautiful but brutal, and it's packed with things to do, whether it's taking down outposts, climbing radio towers which some people might not like, or using the game's variety of takedowns. The gameplay is fun and satisfying. Far Cry 3 established the formula that has carried on into future games, but it's the perfect balance here that makes it stand out. So yeah, Far Cry 3 is my favourite Far Cry game. It's just a combination of a psychological story, the memorable characters, Vaas, and even exciting gameplay is why Far Cry 3 remains my favourite in the series. It's just a shame that the writing and pure passion that went into this game is nowhere to be seen in the more recent Far Cry games. So there we have it. That is my definitive ranking of every Far Cry game, except well the countless Far Cry 1 alterations. But yeah, what's your favourite Far Cry game? If I was to guess, it's either Far Cry 4, 5 or 3, let's be honest. As always, shout out to the members of my Patreon, link will be down below for that. If you did enjoy this video, be sure to hit that subscribe button, and with that said, I'll see you in the next one.